The deep dive starts now. If you are looking for the full, detailed history that explains the current devastating conflict in Sudan, you are in the right place. Our sources detail a relentless chronology of coups and civil war that stretches back not just decades, but really to antiquity.
It is a history essential to understanding today's crisis.
Hmm.
Sudan has, perhaps tragically, earned the title of a laboratory of coups. Since independence in 1956, the nation has endured nearly 35 attempted military takeovers, with 6 of those being successful.
35 attempts.
Nearly, yeah. Or actual coups, 6 successful. This isn't just political turbulence. It's a deep, destructive cycle of instability.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to unpack that entire chronology. We are tracing the fault lines, the deep cultural and geographical divisions, the corrosive influence of colonial policy, the rise of political Islam, and ultimately the disastrous rivalry between the military strongmen, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan of the SAF, and General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hamedi, of the RSF.
Right. The complexity of Sudan lies in the convergence of history, ideology, and geography. We see colonial administrative decisions exacerbating regional splits, religious fundamentalism attempting to unify a deeply diverse population, and intense resource competition for oil, and now critically, for gold, constantly fueling the conflict.
So, to truly grasp the present, we must begin at the source, the Nile Valley thousands of years ago.
Exactly. Back to the foundations. #Take2. Ancient and medieval foundations.
Let's start with the foundations of the nation in the Great Kingdom of Kush, running from roughly 780 BC to 350 AD. We are talking about an ancient kingdom in Nubia, centered along the Nile Valley, encompassing modern northern Sudan and southern Egypt.
Yeah, and the scope of Kushite power is easily overlooked. The period is often referred to as the Kushite Empire.
An empire, really.
Oh yes, the height of their military and political reach is recorded in Egypt as the 25th dynasty. For a time, these rulers, based far south in the Nile Valley, actually controlled the land of the pharaohs.
That's incredible. It really underscores their military sophistication and administrative capability.
It does, and their legacy is far more than just monuments and military might. When we dig into the technological profile of the Kushites, particularly during the later Meroitic period, one innovation stands out that speaks volumes about their society and structure: the development of the Hafir.
The Hafir. What exactly was that, and what does this specific technology tell us about early power dynamics?
It is vital to recognize that technology because it highlights the fundamental resource fault line in that region: water. A Hafir was a massive, carefully engineered reservoir designed to catch and store the scarce rainfall during the brief wet season.
So like a giant water tank, essentially.
Basically, yeah, but on an enormous scale. This wasn't merely about irrigation for crops. It was the key to stabilizing the population, supporting large herds of cattle, and establishing centralized political control.
So the ability to control and allocate that water.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for, drinking water, keeping cattle alive through the dry season.
The really long, brutal, dry season.
Right. That ability became a huge source of political power right from the start.
Yeah.
Centralized power.
Is there a specific example that illustrates this scale?
Precisely. We have a powerful example: the Great Hafir at Musawarat Sufra. This reservoir measured an astonishing 250 meters in diameter and was 6.3 meters deep.
Wow. 250 meters across.
Huge. Imagine the planning and manpower required to excavate and maintain a public works project of that scale back then. It implies a highly centralized, sophisticated, and stable government necessary to coordinate labor and manage that critical resource across vast distances.
So this early reliance on the Nile and this kind of centralized resource management set a pattern that persists even today in some ways.
In many ways, yes. Control over resources, central authority. It's a recurring theme.
Following the decline of the Kingdom of Kush around 350 AD, the region didn't simply vanish. It transitioned into a period dominated by powerful, distinct Christian kingdoms.
That's right. Kingdoms like Alodia, Makuria, and Obahia arose. This was a completely different cultural landscape, maintaining Coptic Christian traditions and unique Nubian languages for centuries.
So Christianity was dominant for a long time there.
For centuries, they effectively acted as buffers between the Islamic world expanding from the north and the rest of Africa. This medieval period demonstrates the long history of independent, non-Islamic governance in the area that is now Sudan. It wasn't always Arabic-speaking or Muslim.
How did that cultural and religious landscape begin to shift with the arrival of Islamic influence? Was it conquest or something else?
It was a long, gradual process, often driven initially by trade and migration rather than outright conquest in the central areas. But we see a key political acceleration during the Funj Sultanate, which dominated the central Nile Valley from the 16th century onwards.
Okay, the Funj Sultanate. What was the turning point there?
The specific turning point was a coup in 1718. The new regime initiated a clear policy shift, pursuing a more orthodox form of Islam and aggressively promoting the Arabization of the state and its administration.
Arabization, making Arabic the language of government and promoting Arab identity.
Exactly. And to solidify that new power structure, the Funj propagated a very specific and quite strategic foundational narrative, didn't they?
How so? What narrative?
Yes, they claimed descent from the Umayyad dynasty, one of the earliest Islamic caliphates based in Damascus.
Why was that claim so important? Was it even true?
Well, its historical accuracy is debated, but its political importance was huge. This narrative was crucial because it wasn't really about ethnic identity initially, but about political legitimacy. By claiming this noble Arab ancestry, the Funj sought to legitimize their rule over the increasingly large population of Arab subjects and migrants in the region. It provided a religious and historical basis for their authority over diverse groups.
So it was a way to unify or at least justify ruling over different peoples under an Islamic Arab banner.
Precisely. This cultural and political project culminated in a major linguistic shift by the 19th century.
What happened by then?
By then, Arabic had become the dominant language across central riverine Sudan and most of Kordofan. Crucially, this cultural transformation was driven not just by imposition from the top down, but also by interaction on the ground.
How did that work?
Well, Arab tribes claiming descent from migrants intermarried extensively with indigenous populations, Nubian and other African groups. And through this continuous process of social mixing, intermarriage, and trade, they gradually introduced Islam more broadly.
So it was a mix of state policy and social change over centuries.
Exactly. This centuries-long cultural mixing and the resulting establishment of an Arabic-speaking, predominantly Islamic riverine elite created the foundational cultural and geographical split that the British would later exploit and entrench during the colonial period. That north-south riverine versus periphery dynamic has deep roots. #3, Decolonization and the First Civil War, 1955-1972.
That historical division brings us directly to the colonial era, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. From the late 19th century until independence in 1956, Britain and Egypt technically ran a condominium, a sort of joint rule. But in practice,
the British were firmly in charge of the administration, and they actively enforced a policy that deepened that north-south division we just talked about.
how did they do that? This colonial legacy seems absolutely critical.
It is perhaps the single most important factor in the subsequent civil wars. Until 1946, Britain governed northern and southern Sudan as two completely separate entities. Different laws, different administrative languages, different educational systems.
Why? What was the logic?
The British viewed the South, which was predominantly animist and Christian, with African languages, as culturally closer to their East African colonies like Uganda and Kenya. They actively discouraged any trade, travel, or administrative interaction with the Arabic-speaking Islamic North. They even required permits to travel between the two regions.
Wow, like internal borders.
Effectively, yes. This created two wholly separate political and educational trajectories. The North developed an Arabic-based administration and education system, while the South used English and relied heavily on Christian missionaries for education.
And then, in a devastating administrative reversal, they forced integration. Why did the British suddenly abandon this separation policy in 1946, just before independence?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Well,
But political pressure from the northern elite was overwhelming. The educated northern nationalists demanded a unified Sudan under their leadership as independence approached. The British, perhaps wanting a simpler handover or underestimating the consequences, made the abrupt decision to merge the two areas into a single administrative region.
and the immediate consequence for the South.
Catastrophic. Arabic was imposed as the administrative language throughout the entire country, including the South. This instantly sidelined the English-trained, mission-educated Southern elite. They were completely unprepared to compete for administrative roles in a newly unified, Arabic-dominated civil service. They were locked out overnight.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. And the ultimate expression of this structural exclusion came with the Sudanization Committee in 1953, established during the transition to self-rule. What was its job?
This committee was tasked with filling the senior administrative roles being vacated by departing British and Egyptian staff. essentially deciding who would run the independent country.
And the outcome.
The numbers are a shocking indictment of the process. The committee was responsible for allocating 800 senior administrative positions. Think about that, 800 top jobs shaping the new nation.
Okay, and how many went to Southerners?
6. Just 6 out of 800.
6. That's blatant exclusion.
It was absolute. This single deliberate act ensured that the Southern elite, educated and aspiring, were almost entirely shut out of the future government before the country even gained independence. It confirmed their worst fears, that Northern dominance would be total and their distinct identity ignored.
This inherent structural inequality immediately sparked unrest, laying the ground for conflict before the flag was even raised on Independence Day in 1956. But the initial political landscape after independence was incredibly volatile anyway, wasn't it?
It was fragile from day one. The first government, led by Prime Minister Ismail al-Azhari's National Unionist Party, NUP, governed in a coalition. But that coalition quickly collapsed due to internal infighting.
What were they fighting about?
A key issue was the burning question of whether Sudan should unify with Egypt. The NUP itself split over this. The civilian government became paralyzed by these divisions.
And in the face of that political vacuum, the military inevitably stepped in. This is where the laboratory of coups idea really starts, isn't it?
It does. The first successful coup d'etat occurred barely 2 years after independence, in 1958.
Who took over?
The stalemated civilian coalition was overthrown by the Chief of Staff, Brigadier Ibrahim Aboud. This established the blueprint for Sudanese politics. Civilian instability is routinely solved, or perhaps just interrupted, by military intervention.
How long did Aboud's regime last?
6 years, until 1964. And his administration's major focus, particularly regarding the South, was on crushing the discontent that had already flared up due to the exclusion and the imposition of Arabic and Islamic policies.
So the military response escalated quickly under Aboud and continued even after him.
Yes, particularly under the successor Majub government, which came after Aboud fell. They launched major offensives to crush the burgeoning rebellion in the South. And these weren't just military campaigns. They often involved government atrocities against civilians.
What kind of atrocities are we talking about?
Our sources detail the brutality. Reports of massacres in towns like Juba and Wau, the burning of churches and villages, the systematic closing of schools in the South. It seemed aimed at destroying not just the rebellion, but the cultural and educational infrastructure of the South itself, which only fueled the resolve of the rebels.
But this military rule eventually fostered deep resentment across the entire country, not just the South, leading to a dramatic civilian uprising known as the October Revolution of 1964.
That's right. And interestingly, that revolution was sparked by an incredibly specific, localized event.
What happened?
Security forces raided the University of Khartoum during a seminar. And the topic of the seminar? The problem of the southern Sudan.
Wow. So attacking academic freedom on that sensitive issue was the final straw.
It was the catalyst. That single raid triggered nationwide protests. Students were joined by professionals, trade unions. It became a massive, crippling general strike across the country. The pressure was immense.
And it worked.
It did. It forced Brigadier Aboud's resignation. This brief success led to an interim civilian government, proving the power of civilian mobilization. But crucially, it couldn't stop the conflict in the South, which had already taken root and was now a full-blown civil war.
Which brings us to the first Sudanese civil war itself. It actually started before independence.
That's a key point. It technically began on August 18, 1955, when Southern Army units mutinied, fearing redeployment to the North under Northern officers. So yes, before independence. And it lasted for over 16 years, until 1972.
16 years. What were the rebels, mainly drawn from the southern ethnic groups like the Dinka and Nuer, fighting for during this incredibly long war? Was it immediate secession from the start?
Initially, their demands, represented by groups like the Anya movement, were focused on greater representation and, crucially, autonomy within the existing government structure. They felt entirely subordinated to the northern-dominated central government in Khartoum.
So not necessarily breaking away, but securing their rights within Sudan.
Exactly, at first.
Yeah.
They wanted regional self-government, protection for their cultures and religions, and an end to the policies attempting to impose cultural uniformity, specifically Arabic and Islam, on them. Secession became a stronger goal as the war dragged on, and the government's response remained brutal.
That long, bloody conflict finally concluded with the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972. What were the key provisions that managed to bring about a decade of peace? Seems like a rare success story.
It was a major achievement, brokered largely by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. The agreement granted substantial partial autonomy to the south, establishing a southern Sudan autonomous region with its own regional executive and assembly based in Juba.
So real self-government for the South.
Yes, significant powers were devolved, and crucially, the terms of the agreement were enshrined into Sudan's first permanent constitution, giving them legal weight and protection. It wasn't just a political deal, it was constitutional law.
And it worked.
For a time, yes. The peace held for the next 11 years, from 1972 to 1983. It demonstrated that a commitment to federalism, recognizing the country's diversity and respecting Southern identity, could stabilize the nation. It's a critical lesson that, unfortunately, would later be tragically forgotten. #Tippyful. The rise of political Islam and the Second Civil War, 1977 to 2005.
The peace established by the Addis Ababa Agreement proved to be fragile, and the man often credited or perhaps blamed for its ultimate destruction was a single, highly influential ideologue.
Hassan al-Turabi.
Al-Turabi's influence on modern Sudanese history cannot be overstated. He was the intellectual architect of the Islamist movement in Sudan. Highly educated, charismatic.
Educated where? He held degrees from the University of London and the Sorbonne in Paris. He possessed this unique ability to merge traditional Islamic thought with modern political theory, making it appealing to a new generation.
And his political career was quite turbulent.
Very. He served periods in high office interspersed with imprisonment, demonstrating his resilience and, frankly, his subversive influence. He was a master political operator.
He was actually imprisoned for 7 years under President Ghaffar Nimri, who had originally come to power in a leftist coup in 1969, but later shifted rightward. Yet Nimri eventually brought al-Turabi back into the fold.
That's right. Nimri appointed him Attorney General in 1979 and later Foreign Affairs Advisor in 1983.
What was Nimri's political motivation for bringing in such a powerful and radical figure? Seems risky.
Nimri was facing increasing political pressure and economic stagnation by the late 70s and early 80s. His socialist policies had failed. By co-opting al-Turabi and the nascent Islamist movement, he hoped to shore up support from religious conservatives, find a new ideological basis for his rule, and deflect attention from his own failings.
A dangerous game.
Extremely. It allowed al-Turabi to move from being an opposition figure to being a central fencer of power, which he quickly consolidated, building his network within the state.
Al-Turabi formally established the political wing of his movement, the National Islamic Front, in If, in 1985, although its roots go back earlier. His political project, focused on transforming Sudan into a purely Islamic state, stood in direct contradiction to the secular compromises of the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement.
That ideological conflict was the direct cause of the next war. Islamic fundamentalists within the NES and increasingly within Nimri's government were profoundly discontent with the autonomy granted to the predominantly non-Muslim South. They viewed the 1972 agreement as an unacceptable compromise, a violation of Islamic principles that undermined the goal of a fully unified Islamic nation under Sharia law.
The breaking point came in 1983. What exactly happened?
President Nimri, heavily influenced by the Islamists and desperate to save his regime, made a series of fateful decisions. He abruptly declared all of Sudan an Islamic state, imposing what became known as the September Laws, his interpretation of Sharia law nationally. And critically, he unilaterally terminated the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region established by the Addis Ababa Agreement.
Just dismantled it after only 11 years.
Yes. That single unilateral declaration was the match that lit the fuse of the Second Sudanese Civil War, which lasted from 1983 all the way to 2005, 22 years.
How did the South react?
They saw this as the ultimate betrayal. The definitive rejection of their distinct identity, their hard-won autonomy, and the constitutional promises made in 1972. It confirmed that Khartoum could not be trusted.
In response, the military wing of the South organized rapidly.
Yes. In May 1983, anticipating these moves, units of the Sudanese army based in the South, particularly the 1st Division's 105th Battalion stationed in Bor and Piber, mutinied. They rejected the central government's authority, retreated into the bush, and formed the core of the new rebel army, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA, led by Colonel John Garang.
So this wasn't just a continuation of the first war, it had a different character.
It did. While rooted in the same historical grievances, this conflict was fundamentally framed as ethno-religious and structural. The central government, now fully committed to al-Turabi's ideological project, was explicitly imposing Sharia on non-Muslim populations.
Then the structural issues.
The war was also driven by deeply exploitative governance, continuing those colonial-era policies that favored the riverine northern elites. The resource wealth of the periphery, not just the south, but also areas like the Nubia Mountains and Blue Nile, was extracted for the benefit of Khartoum, with little reinvestment locally. The SPLA, under Garang, actually advocated for a new Sudan, a secular, unified country that addressed these inequalities, not just southern secession initially.
Al-Turabi's influence reached its historical climax a few years later, in 1989. Nimeri had been overthrown in 1985, and there was a brief period of shaky democratic rule under Sadiq al-Mahdi. But that didn't last.
No. The Democrats were weak, divided, and unable to end the war or fix the economy. Al-Turabi, operating from behind the scenes, was the alleged architect of the military coup on June 30th, 1989, that ultimately overthrew the democratically elected government of Sadiq al-Mahdi and installed a previously obscure army officer, Lieutenant General Omar al-Bashir.
Al-Bashir, the name that would dominate Sudan for the next 30 years.
Exactly. That 1989 coup was the institutionalization of al-Turabi's political Islam. The new al-Bashir regime, guided by the Nef, was absolutely committed to the radical transformation of Sudan along Islamist lines.
What were the immediate consequences of the coup in terms of governance and law?
The consolidation of power was swift and violent. The ruling body, the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation, RCC, immediately banned all trade unions, political parties, and independent newspapers. They systematically purged the administration, the judiciary, and the army, eliminating anyone not deemed loyal to the new Islamist ideology.
How many people were purged?
The figure often cited is around 78,000 members of the administration removed from their posts. It was a complete reshaping of the state's civil and military structures to ensure NIF control.
And the legal framework they used to enforce this new reality was the notorious Criminal Act of 1991. What did that involve?
The Criminal Act of 1991 was designed to enforce a strict version of Islamic moral and social order nationwide with extreme severity. It instituted harsh hudud punishments, including public flogging for alcohol consumption, amputation for theft, stoning for adultery, and even crucifixion in certain cases like highway robbery.
Nationwide, even in the non-Muslim South.
That was the controversial part. While the southern states were supposed to have some theoretical exemptions from the strictest Islamic prohibitions like alcohol bans, the law explicitly provided for the possible future application of Sharia across the entire South. More immediately, the law was vigorously used to arrest and apply Sharia penalties to non-Muslims living in the north, especially displaced southerners in Khartoum. Flogging and other punishments were common, effectively enforcing the Islamist agenda across the capital and sending a clear message.
This regime quickly became infamous internationally for its brutal suppression of civil dissidents.
Yes. Torture, arbitrary detention, and extrajudicial executions were commonplace, used to intimidate any opposition. Our sources cite notorious detention centers, sometimes called ghost houses, and places like the White House or Giada Barracks in Juba became known as centers for these atrocities. The regime showed a complete disregard for human rights in its quest for absolute control.
The al-Bashir regime also actively courted international isolation, particularly concerning the United States, almost from the beginning.
A key turning point there was Sudan's vocal support for Saddam Hussein during the 1990-91 Gulf War after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. This decision completely alienated the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
What were the consequences?
It dramatically changed U.S. attitudes. Washington placed Sudan on the list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1993, imposed sanctions, prohibited most aid, and actively pursued policies to isolate Sudan as a rogue state.
And crucially, this period cemented Sudan as a safe haven for global militancy, directly thanks to al-Turabi's political maneuvering and ideological alignment.
This is one of the most remarkable and frankly chilling details in the entire timeline. Osama bin Laden moved his base of operations from Saudi Arabia to Sudan around 1991.
He just showed up.
The sources indicate he was personally invited by al-Turabi, who saw him as both an ideological ally and a potential source of investment and support. Bin Laden stayed until 1996, when Sudan expelled him under intense international pressure, particularly from the U.S. and Egypt.
What was the arrangement? What did bin Laden do while he was there?
It seems to have been a mutually beneficial relationship for a time. Al-Turabi granted bin Laden a secure environment to run his growing al-Qaeda network, establish businesses, and training camps. In return, bin Laden reportedly helped the Sudanese government with critical infrastructure projects, like road building, and even provided some support, possibly fighters or funding, for the government's war against the SPLA separatists in the south. It was, for a time, a state-sponsored partnership with global terrorism. Hashtag v Darfur and the Path to Secession, 2003-2011.
While the Second Civil War raged primarily between the North and South, another devastating conflict metastasized in the West, in the vast arid region of Darfur, starting seriously around 2003. Darfur has its own unique history, right?
Very much so. Darfur possesses a long and distinct identity. It was an independent sultanate, the Sultanate of Darfur, for centuries, until it was conquered and incorporated into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan only in 1916. It has different ethnic groups, different historical grievances.
So the conflict there had different roots than the North-South War.
Yes, though connected by the theme of marginalization by Khartoum. The initial rebellion in Darfur, which began simmering in 2001 and erupted fully in 2003, was distinct from the SPLA. Rebel groups like the Sudan Liberation Movement Army, SLMA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, emerged.
What were they fighting for?
They focused initially on protecting primarily non-Arab agricultural communities, groups like the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa, from attacks by government-sponsored Arab militias. It was driven by decades of political marginalization, neglect by the central government, competition over scarce land and water resources exacerbated by drought and desertification, and disputes between nomadic Arab pastoralists and settled non-Arab farmers.
So local resource conflicts inflamed by government neglect.
And government manipulation. When the conventional Sudanese army, SAF, struggled to defeat these decentralized, mobile rebels operating in harsh terrain, the al-Bashir government implemented a devastating strategic shift in their counterinsurgency plan. They decided to outsource the ground war.
How do they do that?
They pivoted away from relying solely on the SF. They prioritized their air force for bombing campaigns, military intelligence for targeting, and, most critically, the mass mobilization and arming of the Janjaweed.
The Janjaweed, who were they exactly?
These were predominantly armed Baggara Arab herders, often referred to, translating roughly, as devils on horseback or men on horses with guns. They became the central, brutal pillar of the counterinsurgency strategy in Darfur, unleashed against communities suspected of supporting the rebels.
The government consistently denied supporting them, didn't they? They claimed it was just tribal conflict.
They did deny it publicly. But the evidence compiled by human rights groups, journalists, and later the ICC is overwhelming. The sources confirm they did more than just support them. Khartoum provided weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, salaries, intelligence, and crucially coordinated air support from SF bombers and helicopter gunships. Essentially, the Janjaweed were weaponized as a state proxy militia and given free rein to prosecute the war on the ground.
And the result was?
Systemic, widespread attacks on civilian populations belonging to the Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa groups, mass killings, systematic rape used as a weapon of war, the burning of hundreds of villages, destruction of wells and food stores, and the forced displacement of millions of people into camps or across the border into Chad.
The sheer scale of the atrocity led to accusations of genocide.
Yes. The start of the Darfur Genocide is often dated to February 26, 2003, following a major rebel attack. The tactics employed, the targeting of specific ethnic groups, the intent to destroy their livelihoods and drive them off their land, drew immediate and horrifying comparisons to the Rwandan genocide a decade earlier.
Did the international community formally recognize it as genocide?
The U.S. government, under Secretary of State Colin Powell in 2004, did declare that genocide had occurred in Darfur. While there was debate within the UN about the legal definition, the scale of ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity was undeniable. Hundreds of thousands are estimated to have died, and millions remain displaced today. The ICC later issued arrest warrants for al-Bashir and other officials for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur.
It's staggering that this was happening while negotiations were underway to end the North-South War.
It is. Despite the tragedy unfolding in Darfur, the Second Sudanese Civil War, North-South, was finally brought to a negotiated conclusion with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA, signed in Nairobi, Kenya on January 9, 2005. After years of talks, heavily pushed by the U.S. and regional powers.
What were the main points of the CPA? It was supposed to be the definitive solution, right?
It was intended to be. First, and most famously, it granted the South a 6-year period of autonomy, culminating in a promised referendum on independence to be held in 2011.
Second,
it addressed the economic core of the conflict, oil. The vast majority of Sudan's oil reserves were in the South. The CPA stipulated that oil revenues were to be divided roughly equally between the North and South during that 6-year interim autonomy period.
And the religious issue, Sharia law.
Third, it resolved the ideological conflict, at least on paper. It specified that national Islamic Sharia law would continue to apply in the north, but its applicability in the south would be decided by the South's own elected assembly. It also protected the rights of non-Muslims in the national capital, Khartoum.
And there was a critical military provision in the CPA that directly foreshadows the current conflict between the generals El-Burhan and Hemeti.
Absolutely crucial point. That provision was the agreement to merge parts of the armed forces, the SF and the SPLA, into Joint Integrated Units, or GIUs. The plan called for a combined force of 39,000 personnel.
What was the thinking behind the GIUs?
The political theory was sound, forcing the formerly warring armies, the SF and the SPLA, to operate together in mixed units deployed across the country, especially in sensitive border areas, would build trust, create a unified national army structure, and theoretically prevent future internal conflicts based on north-south lines.
But it didn't quite work out that way.
The implementation was deeply flawed. Mistrust remained high, funding was insufficient, and both sides often kept their best units separate. The commitment to this genuine military integration was always fragile, and its eventual failure, the inability to truly merge these forces, would directly feed the security dilemmas and the rivalry between military factions that exploded in 2023.
Still, the CPA held up long enough for the independence referendum in January 2011.
It did. And the result was unambiguous. The vote was overwhelming. A near unanimous 98.83% vote in favor of secession. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan formally became the world's newest nation, celebrated in Juba and recognized internationally.
What were the immediate economic consequences for Sudan, North Sudan, as it effectively became?
Immediate and dramatic. South Sudan took with it roughly 75% of Sudan's known oil wealth upon secession.
75%. Gone overnight.
Pretty much. While Sudan retained the crucial refining facilities near Khartoum and the only pipeline infrastructure running to the export terminal at Port Sudan on the Red Sea, the massive loss of government revenue from oil exports severely crippled Khartoum's budget. This economic shock accelerated the financial crises, inflation, and austerity measures that would define the next decade and contribute significantly to the discontent that eventually overthrew Bashir.
But secession, while resolving the main North-South conflict on paper, left behind some deeply entrenched, unresolved regional issues that continue to fuel violence even today.
Absolutely. The CPA wasn't perfect, and several critical issues were kicked down the road or poorly handled. 3 major fault lines remain dangerously active.
What's first?
First, the status of the oil-rich border region of Abyei. It's claimed by both sides, the Dinka-Ngulk, historically aligned with the south, and the Misriya Arab nomads reliant on its pastures, aligned with the north. The CPA mandated a separate referendum for Abyei to decide its fate, but disputes over voter eligibility meant it never happened. It was set up as a sort of temporary joint administration, a condominium, but remains highly contested and has led to sporadic, intense violence.
Okay, Abby, what else?
Second, and crucially for understanding current conflicts beyond Darfur, Khartoum failed to honor promises for popular consultations in 2 other border states, South Kordofan and Blue Nile.
What were these popular consultations?
They were meant to be processes allowing the people in these states who had large populations that fought alongside the SPLA against Khartoum, but remained in the north after secession, to express their views on the CPA and negotiate better governance arrangements. The consultations were poorly defined and ultimately blocked by Khartoum.
And the result?
This perceived betrayal fueled renewed insurgency in those regions shortly after South Sudan's independence. Factions of the SPLM that remained in the north, SPLM North or SPLMN, took up arms again, fighting the central government over issues of marginalization, autonomy, and secularism. These conflicts in South Kordofan, especially the Nubia Mountains, and Blue Nile are still ongoing today and intersect with the current SAF-RSF war, #Tech66, the collapse of the dictatorship and the transitional crisis 2018-2023.
After 30 years of rule, marked by civil wars, genocide in Darfur, international sanctions, and economic decline, Omar al-Bashir's regime finally collapsed in April 2019. Interestingly, it wasn't driven by an external military force or even the ongoing regional rebellions, but by a combination of profound economic despair among the population and, ironically, a self-sabotaging military structure he himself had created.
That's a key insight. Al-Bashir's strategy to remain in power for so long was classic authoritarian maneuvering, coup-proofing. He deliberately cultivated and empowered multiple overlapping and often competing security forces to ensure that no single commander or faction controlled enough power to successfully overthrow him.
Divide and rule, essentially.
Exactly. This division of power, designed to protect him, ultimately became his undoing when the two main pillars turned against him.
Those two competing power centers were the professional military, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or traditionally the backbone of the state, which by then was led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan,
Yeah.
and the other.
And the other was the increasingly powerful paramilitary force, the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, commanded by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, universally known as Hemedti.
Hemedti. He came from the Janjaweed in Darfur, right?
That's his origin. The RSF was formally established in 2013, largely by integrating and rebranding the Janjaweed militias that had prosecuted the Darfur War. Bashir built them up as a counterweight to the regular army, loyal directly to him, and used them for counterinsurgency and internal repression.
And crucially, these two forces had fundamentally different economic bases, which fueled their rivalry.
A critical point. The SAF, like many militaries in the region, controlled vast parts of the formal and informal Sudanese economy, everything from agriculture and construction companies to telecommunications, and was the traditional recipient of state budgeting.
And the RSF under Hemedti.
Hemedti's RSF developed its own massive, independent revenue stream. They achieved this primarily by seizing control of lucrative gold mines, particularly in Darfur, and essentially running a parallel gold export business, much of it allegedly smuggled out, especially to the UAE.
Gold, so that's where Hemedti's wealth comes from.
Largely, yes. Gold became Sudan's biggest export after oil was lost. And the RSF also earned significant hard currency by providing well-paid mercenary troops for foreign conflicts, most notably sending thousands of fighters to support the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen's civil war. This financial autonomy made the RSF uniquely powerful and independent of the state budget, directly challenging the SAF's dominance.
So you have these two armed groups, suspicious of each other, both powerful, both embedded by Bashir. What finally triggered the uprising that brought him down?
The trigger was purely economic, hitting ordinary people incredibly hard. Massive nationwide protests erupted starting in December 2018.
Why then specifically?
The immediate start was a government decision to triple the price of bread and fuel as part of austerity measures demanded by the IMF, attempting to deal with a crippling economic crisis. This was the final straw for a population already facing soaring inflation sources, say over 70%, and acute shortages of cash, fuel, and basic goods.
And the public knew where the money was going, right?
Exactly. The sheer grinding hardship was compounded by widespread public knowledge and anger that the government was still allocating a huge proportion of its budget estimates, ranging from 60 to 70%, to the massive security sector, army, police, intelligence, RSF, while ordinary people couldn't afford bread.
The organization of the protest movement was critical this time. It wasn't just spontaneous riots.
No, the coordination was key. The protests were often led by the Sudanese Professionals Association, SPA, a coalition of doctors, engineers, teachers, along with other civilian groups under the umbrella of the Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC. They used social media effectively and managed to coordinate widespread civil disobedience, strikes, and demonstrations across the country for months.
And their strategy culminated in a massive sit-in.
Yes. In April 2019, the protests culminated in a huge defiant sit-in outside the SF headquarters complex in Khartoum. Tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people camped out.
Why that location?
It was highly symbolic. They were trying to appeal directly to the professional military, the SAF, to abandon Bashir and side with the people against the dictator and his security apparatus, including the RSF. This strategy put immense pressure on the army leadership and ultimately forced their hand.
The military intervention came on April 11th, 2019. What happened?
The top leadership of the SAF and the RSF, Burhan and Hemedti, acting together at this point, intervened. They announced that Bashir had been arrested and removed from power. The dictator was finally gone after 30 years.
Huge celebrations, obviously.
Immense euphoria. But the problem was immediately apparent. The leaders of the two main military factions who had enforced Bashir's rule for years, and who both had blood on their hands from Darfur and elsewhere, remained in charge of the country, forming a transitional military council, TMC.
And the euphoria of the revolution was short-lived and brutally extinguished just weeks later.
Yes, during the devastating Khartoum massacre on June 3, 2019.
What happened on June 3rd?
Security forces, including police and heavily armed troops, moved violently to disperse the peaceful sit-in outside the army headquarters. They used tear gas, whips, batons, and then live ammunition against the unarmed protesters.
And the RSF's role?
The sources are clear. Hemedti's RSF troops were heavily implicated, leading the charge in many areas. They chased protesters, beat them, shot them, and threw bodies into the Nile. Over 100 people were killed, many more wounded or disappeared. It was a horrific crackdown.
So, the first clear signal that the revolution had been hijacked?
Absolutely. The men who had arrested the dictator were immediately turning the same instruments of violence against the democratic movement. The African Union immediately suspended Sudan's membership in response to the massacre, and international condemnation poured in.
This terrible event, however, forced the military council back to the negotiating table with the civilian opposition, didn't it?
It did. Under intense domestic and international pressure, the TMC and the Civilian Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC, eventually signed agreements in August 2019. These established a complex power-sharing arrangement for a 39-month transition period intended to lead to elections.
What did this transitional government look like?
It created a joint military-civilian sovereignty council as the collective head of state. General al-Burhan became its chairman, with Hemedti as his deputy, alongside civilian members. It also appointed a civilian prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok, an internationally respected economist, to lead the cabinet and manage day-to-day governance.
A fragile compromise, putting generals and civilians together.
Extremely fragile.
Yeah.
And the agreement set a ticking clock. According to the terms of the transition, the chair of the Sovereignty Council, the ultimate symbol and locus of authority, should have been transferred from the military leader, Burhan, to a civilian selected by the FFC civilian members in November 2021. The military leadership was facing a hard deadline to cede ultimate power.
This looming deadline, combined with their past actions, seems to have created the precise motivation for the next military intervention, the 2021 coup. What exactly were al-Burhan and Hemedti trying to prevent by seizing power again?
It boils down to self-preservation, power, and impunity. Analysts like Al-Stawal have argued compellingly that both al-Burhan and Hemedti faced two simultaneous existential threats as the civilian handover approached.
What were those threats?
First, the ongoing Sudanese investigation into the June 2019 Khartoum massacre, demanded by the transitional agreement, would almost certainly implicate them or forces under their direct command. Second, the transitional government had started cooperating with the International Criminal Court, ICC, regarding the Darfur case. This meant al-Bashir might finally be handed over, and any trial risked forcing Burhan and Hemedti to testify, or worse, implicating them as co-perpetrators in the Darfur atrocities. Civilian rule meant accountability, potentially jail time, or ICC warrants.
So they had to act before losing control.
From their perspective, yes. They executed the coup on October 25, 2021, just weeks before this scheduled handover, to dismantle the civilian government, derail the accountability processes, and ensure they preserved their power, their economic empires, and, most importantly, their freedom from domestic and international prosecution.
What exactly happened on October 25th, 2021?
The military, led by Burhan, dissolved the civilian cabinet and the Sovereignty Council, declared a nationwide state of emergency, and arrested Prime Minister Hamdok, several cabinet ministers, and other civilian leaders and activists.
And the public reaction?
Immediate and ferocious. Civilian groups, including the powerful Sudanese Professionals Association and the FFC, immediately denounced the coup and called for mass civil disobedience, strikes, and street protests.
Were the protests large?
Immense. They demonstrated the deep commitment of a large part of the Sudanese populace to the democratic transition. Sources reported huge demonstrations, with anywhere from 200,000 to perhaps 2 million people taking to the streets across Sudan on October 30th, demanding the restoration of civilian rule.
And the military response this time, similar to 2019.
Savage again, yes. Designed to crush the democratic movement once and for all. We have extensive reports detailing the violence. Military forces, including the SF and RSF acting together again, tried to remove protesters' barricades, attacked civilians, and used live rounds, especially near the army headquarters in Khartoum.
Casualties?
At least 10 civilians were killed on the first day alone. The repression escalated throughout November, with security forces shooting dead 15 protesters on November 17th during another wave of demonstrations. The total death toll in the months following the coup reached well over 100.
Did they target the organizers again?
Yes. Military forces conducted widespread house-to-house arrests of known protest organizers and resistance committee members, and replicating the tactics of the al-Bashir regime and the post-massacre period in 2019, they immediately imposed internet and telecommunications blackouts across the country.
Why the blackouts?
The Sudanese Journalist Network interpreted these cutoffs, quite plausibly, as a deliberate attempt by the security forces to prevent protesters from organizing, to stop information about the crackdown from getting out, and essentially to commit more crimes and hide evidence, hindering any future accountability efforts. It was a calculated move to operate in the dark.
What's crucial here is that this 2021 coup immediately highlighted the deep polarization of foreign backing for the two generals, Burhan and Hemedti, who supported whom.
It became clearer, though complex.
Ah,
Al-Burhan, representing the traditional military establishment and having trained in Egypt, was seen as primarily backed by Egypt, which often favors stability under military rule in its southern neighbor.
and Hemedti.
Hemedti, controlling the vast gold wealth and providing mercenaries, was seen as mainly supported by the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, though Saudi policy became more nuanced. The UAE in particular saw Hemedti as a key partner in accessing Sudan's gold and projecting influence. This foreign support, or at least tacit acceptance from key regional players, provided the necessary financial and diplomatic cover for the military junta to defy widespread international condemnation and maintain control.
What was the international reaction overall?
Widespread condemnation from the UN, US, EU, and others. The US immediately suspended billions in aid. The World Bank froze assistance. However, the regional powers' backing proved decisive in the short term.
Did Hamdok ever return?
Yes, in a controversial move, Hamdok was reinstated as prime minister following a political agreement brokered in November 2021. But he lacked real power, the streets rejected the deal as legitimizing the coup, and he ultimately resigned just weeks later on January 2, 2022, amid continued violent anti-coup protests. The transition to civilian rule, agreed upon in 2019, was definitively dead.
So, the failure of that transition left the two strongmen, al-Burhan and Hemedti, who had cooperated to oust Bashir and then the civilians, sharing power uneasily. What finally broke that unstable partnership?
The final rift that destroyed this unstable junta crystallized around one specific critical issue: the integration of Hemedti's Rapid Support Forces, RSF, into the regular military, the SF.
That old issue from the CPA, but now between SF and RSF.
Exactly. This integration was the key remaining pillar of the framework agreement signed in December 2022, which aimed to restore a path to civilian rule, promising civilian government by April 2023. But it became the ultimate power struggle between Burhan and Hemedti.
What were the specific points of disagreement, the timeline?
That was a major one. The professional army, the SF under al-Burhan, demanded that the RSF be fully integrated into the military structure within a short time frame, perhaps 2 years.
And
Hemedti, absolutely determined to protect his independent command, his vast paramilitary force, his financial autonomy, and his political influence, flatly insisted on a much longer drawn-out timeline, reportedly demanding 10 years. This would preserve the RSF as a distinct entity for the foreseeable future.
It wasn't just about the time period either, was it?
No. The dispute also covered fundamental issues of command and control. What would be the status of senior RSF officers within the future unified hierarchy? Would they retain their ranks and influence? And crucially, the chain of command. Should RSF forces report ultimately to the army chief, under Burhan, or directly to the overall commander-in-chief, which was also Burhan as head of the Sovereignty Council? Hemedti wanted a structure that preserved his direct authority.
Hemedti also started positioning himself publicly against Burhan before the fighting broke out.
Yes. Sensing the growing instability and perhaps trying to win popular support, Hemedti cleverly tried to rebrand himself as the reformist, the one defending the revolution against the old guard. He publicly expressed regret over participating in the 2021 coup, attempting to distance himself from Burhan. He accused al-Burhan and the SF leadership of scheming to restore old guard Islamist officials associated with the deposed al-Bashir regime to power.
So painting Burhan as the counter-revolutionary.
Precisely. This escalating war of words, combined with movements of RSF troops into Khartoum and around strategic sites without SAF approval, signaled the complete breakdown of trust and the imminent collapse of the security arrangement. The failure to agree on the terms and timing of RSF integration was the definitive prelude to the outbreak of the 2023 civil war. #Tag7, the current Sudanese civil war, 2023 present.
On April 15th, 2023, the simmering tension, the rivalry, the dispute over integration, it all exploded into open conflict between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, under General Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, under General Hemedti. The battle for control over Sudan, and potentially for the very existence of the state, began right in the heart of the capital, Khartoum.
The eruption was sudden and total, though tensions had been building visibly for weeks. The fighting immediately centered around key strategic sites: the Presidential Palace, the SF military headquarters, the State Television Building, and critically, Khartoum International Airport.
Why the airport?
Control of the airport meant control over who and what could come into or leave the capital: reinforcements, supplies, foreign evacuation flights. It was a primary objective for both sides from hour one.
And Khartoum itself, a major city.
A pre-war metropolis of over 6.5 million people. It was instantly transformed into a devastating urban war zone. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, subjected to relentless airstrikes by the CIF, which had air power superiority, heavy artillery duels, and brutal house-to-house combat as RSF fighters embedded themselves in residential neighborhoods.
Did the leaders target each other personally?
It seems so. Reports indicated Hemedti explicitly directed his forces to capture or kill al-Burhan in the initial hours. Al-Burhan was initially besieged at the SAF headquarters complex, a key battleground. He managed to evade capture, however, and months later, in August 2023, escaped Khartoum and relocated his base of operations to Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast, which remains the SAF's temporary capital.
And communication, like in previous crises.
Cut almost immediately. As in 2019 and 2021, telecommunications networks, internet, and phone lines were severely disrupted or completely cut off in Khartoum and other conflict zones. This prevented civilians from coordinating aid or evacuation, spread panic, and severely limited the ability of journalists and international monitors to accurately document the fighting and atrocities in real time.
Meanwhile, the information war raged.
Intensely. Both sides put out competing narratives. Hemedti accused al-Burhan of being a pawn of radical Islamic militants and trying to bring back the deposed al-Bashir regime. Burhan painted Hemedti and the RSF as mutinous rebels and foreign-backed mercenaries destroying the country. Verifying claims became extremely difficult due to the communication blackout and restricted access.
Let's look closely at the key areas of conflict beyond Khartoum, starting with Darfur, the RSF's original stronghold and Hemedti's power base. What happened there?
Darfur immediately plunged back into large-scale violence, arguably even worse than before in some areas. The RSF, drawing on its local recruitment base and alliances with Arab militias, rapidly consolidated its control over most of the vast region, capturing major cities like Nyala and El Geneina, often after fierce fighting with the CSAF garrisons.
And the consequences for civilians, particularly non-Arab groups.
Disastrous and horrifying. There have been widespread reports of massacres and alleged ethnic cleansing, specifically targeting non-Arab groups like the Massacre, particularly in and around El Geneina, the capital of West Darfur. Eyewitnesses described RSS and allied Arab militias systematically hunting down, killing, and raping Massacre civilians, destroying their property, and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee into neighboring Chad.
Comparisons to the earlier genocide.
Yes. The intensity and targeted nature of the violence in El Geneina, in particular, were described by UN officials and human rights groups as bearing horrifying similarities to the peak of the Darfur Genocide in 2003-2004. Some officials stated it was worse, given the speed and brutality. The ICC has opened new investigations into these alleged atrocities. This intense violence in Darfur must have affected the old Darfur rebel groups, the ones who signed peace deals earlier. It profoundly shifted alliances. Several major Darfur rebel factions that had previously signed peace agreements with Khartoum and remained neutral at the start of the SAF-RSF war, including factions of the Justice and Equality Movement, JTM, led by Jibril Ibrahim, and the Sudan Liberation Movement Army, SLM, led by Mini Minawi, who were part of the transitional government, realized the existential threat posed by the RSF's campaign.
What did they do?
They renounced their neutrality in late 2023 and declared war on the RSF, aligning themselves with the SF. This added another complex layer to the conflict, essentially reigniting aspects of the older Darfur conflict within the new civil war. However, another major faction, the SLM, led by Abdel Wahid al-Nur, which never signed peace deals, remains largely outside the fray, controlling territory in Jebel Mara.
Outside of Darfur and Khartoum, the conflict immediately flared up in those regions we discussed earlier that never received their promised popular consultations, South Kordofan and Blue Nile.
Exactly. Here, the conflict involves primarily the SPLM-N al-Hilu faction. This group, led by Abdelaziz al-Hilu, had been fighting Khartoum for decades, demanding a secular state and regional autonomy, and controlled significant territory in the Nubia Mountains of South Kordofan and parts of Blue Nile.
What did they do when the RSF war started?
They saw an opportunity. With the SS preoccupied fighting the RSF, the SPLM-N al-Hilu escalated its own insurgency, launching attacks against SAS positions and expanding the territory under its control in South Kordofan.
Did they ally with either side?
Initially, they seemed opportunistic, fighting the SAF but not formally joining the RSF. However, significantly, they signed an agreement with the non-aligned Darfur rebel group, SLM-Elmer, pledging to cooperate in removing the current military government from power. This illustrates the convergence of various long-standing peripheral rebel agendas against the Khartoum regime, whether SAF or RSF is in charge.
Perhaps the most significant strategic shift on the battlefield occurred later, in December 2023, with the RSF advance into the Gezira state south of Khartoum. Why was this so important?
The Gezira state is crucial. It's Sudan's agricultural heartland, the fertile breadbasket of the nation, home to the massive Gezira Scheme irrigation project. Its capital, Wad Madani, had also become a major refuge for hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the fighting in Khartoum, and a key hub for humanitarian aid operations.
And the RSF captured it.
Yes. In a rapid advance in December 2023, RSF forces seized the strategic Hantu Bridge over the Blue Nile and entered Wad Madani with surprisingly limited resistance. The SS 1st Infantry Division stationed there largely withdrew or collapsed.
What was the impact?
It was a massive, symbolic, and strategic victory for the RSF. It demonstrated their ability to project power well beyond Khartoum and Darfur, seizing crucial economic centers. It caused another huge wave of displacement as people who had fled to Wad Madani had to flee again, and it severely disrupted agricultural production and major aid routes, worsening the already dire humanitarian situation.
Beyond the battlefield shifts, the true cost is the massive humanitarian and economic devastation inflicted upon the civilian population. The scale seems almost unimaginable.
It is heartbreaking. The displacement figures alone are staggering. By late 2024 or early 2025 estimates, well over 8 million people have been displaced internally within Sudan. Another 2 million or more have fled the country as refugees, mostly to desperately poor neighboring countries like Chad, South Sudan, and Egypt, creating enormous regional strain.
And the crisis is regional in other ways, too.
Yes, tragically. By October 2025, our outline notes that approximately 300,000 people had fled from neighboring South Sudan into Sudan, likely returnees escaping instability or seeking aid. This highlights the complete regional interconnectedness of instability and desperation.
We hear reports of widespread hunger and potential famine.
It's not just potential. Famine has been confirmed by humanitarian agencies in multiple areas, particularly in Darfur and parts of Khartoum state, controlled by the RSF, where aid access is severely restricted. The conflict has shattered the economy, destroyed infrastructure, prevented planting and harvesting seasons, and sent food prices soaring. Increases of up to 300% in some regions have been reported.
What are the malnutrition figures?
Terrifying, especially for children. The UN reported in May 2025 that nearly 4 million children under 5 were acutely malnourished across the country. Critically, over 770,000 of those children were suffering from severe acute malnutrition, meaning they were at high risk of death without immediate therapeutic feeding and medical treatment. The complete collapse of the healthcare system alongside the food crisis has created a humanitarian catastrophe of the highest order.
And compounding this is the deliberate targeting and looting of humanitarian aid infrastructure. This isn't just collateral damage.
No, the sources detail systematic theft and obstruction, particularly, though not exclusively, attributed to RSF forces. Over $13 million worth of food aid was reportedly looted by the RSF in just the first 20 days of the conflict. The documented looting of massive World Food Program warehouses in El Obeid resulted in the loss of food intended to feed 4.4 million people.
Why? Is it just theft or strategic?
It appears to be both. It's theft to sustain their own forces and enrich commanders, but it's also likely a calculated tactic to deny resources to populations under SAF control, or perceived as hostile, and to cripple aid operations, potentially using hunger as a weapon of war and control. Access denial for aid agencies has been a huge problem.
The economic collapse is equally profound. What are the metrics of the financial devastation beyond food prices?
The formal economy has imploded. Economic activity was estimated to have fallen by over a third, maybe 40% or more, in the first year of the conflict alone. The total estimated physical damage to infrastructure, businesses, and homes is enormous. The outline mentions $9 billion, but that might be conservative now.
And looting.
An additional $40 billion in looted property and goods was estimated, particularly concentrated in Khartoum and South Darfur initially, as RSF forces systematically plundered banks, businesses, homes, and even museums.
What about gold, Hamedi's source of power?
Even that sector has been severely damaged by the instability, although the RSF likely still controls key mines. Overall, official gold production reportedly fell drastically from 18 tons pre-war to just 2 tons recorded through official channels, though smuggling doubtless continues. The RSF was also directly accused of looting gold and vast amounts of silver from the Sudan Central Bank's gold refinery in Khartoum early in the conflict, consolidating wealth directly from the state's coffers through the spoils of war.
And amidst all this chaos, we have the most horrific accounts centering on sexual violence reported in the conflict zones.
Yes, the UN and human rights organizations have documented widespread and systematic conflict-related sexual violence, used as a tactic of war, humiliation, and terror by both sides, but with numerous reports pointing to RSF culpability in many areas.
What kind of scale are we talking about?
The UN reported in March 2025 that the scope is terrifying. Reports indicated that survivors included women, girls, men, and boys, with children as young as 1 year old, reported among the survivors of sexual assault. This systemic violence, often ethnically targeted, demonstrates the complete breakdown of law, order, and basic humanity in the conflict zones, leaving deep psychological scars alongside the physical ones.
The complexity and endurance of this conflict are impossible to understand without analyzing the deep foreign involvement. This isn't a purely internal struggle. It's heavily influenced, maybe even fueled, by external arms suppliers and competing regional interests.
Absolutely. The arms pipeline is complex, murky, and involves many states hedging their bets or pursuing their own agendas. Let's start with Russia and the Wagner Group.
Wagner was known to be close to Hemeti before the war, right? Involved in the gold trade.
Yes. Wagner had established links with Hemeti, reportedly helping secure gold mines and providing training in exchange for access to resources. Early in the 2023 conflict, Wagner was reported to have supplied critical surface-to-air missiles, MANPADS, to the RSF, which helped them counter the SF's initial air superiority.
Where did these weapons come from?
Reports suggested they were routed through Wagner-controlled bases in neighboring Libya under General Khalifa Haftar, who also received UAE support, and potentially from existing Russian Wagner assets in the Central African Republic, another country where Wagner has deep involvement in resource extraction and security. This was crucial early support for Hemeti.
However, that relationship seems to have shifted, signaling Russia's changing strategic priorities in the Red Sea region.
That's right. While Russia might have initially benefited from the chaos or even armed both sides covertly, its strategic preference began to visibly shift toward the SF, the state military, by mid-2024.
Why the shift?
This coincided with renewed discussions between Moscow and Burhan's government about finalizing a long-stalled agreement to construct a Russian naval base at Port Sudan on the Red Sea. This suggests Russia now sees the traditional military and the state structure it represents as a more reliable partner for securing its strategic interests, particularly access to the Red Sea, rather than backing the paramilitary force seen by many as destabilizing.
Meanwhile, the two key Gulf states, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who initially supported the Transitional Military Council together after Bashir's fall, have taken differing roles, with the UAE being strongly and persistently implicated in backing Hemeti and the RSF.
That has been a major factor. The UAE has been repeatedly accused by UN experts, journalists, and the SF itself of continuing to send weapons, drones, ammunition, and other military supplies to the RSF throughout the conflict.
How are these weapons getting there?
Reportedly via clandestine airlifts into neighboring countries, particularly Chad, using Amdras Airport near the Sudanese border, and potentially through routes involving allies in East Africa or even Yemen, despite the UAE publicly promising only humanitarian aid.
What's the UAE's motivation?
Their economic interest seems primary. They have deep ties to Hemeti's gold networks, with Dubai being a major hub for Sudanese gold, much of it thought to be smuggled. Supporting Hemeti might be seen as protecting or expanding access to this resource and projecting influence in the Horn of Africa and Red Sea region.
Has this caused diplomatic problems?
Major problems. The SAF government in Port Sudan has openly accused the UAE of fueling the war. In December 2023, Sudan declared 15 UAE diplomats persona non grata due to these allegations. And later, the SAF displayed captured weapons, including drones and armored vehicles, allegedly supplied by the UAE to the RSF, providing physical evidence of continued backing.
And then there's Iran, which seems to be playing a more complex game.
Yes. Iran had been largely shut out of Sudan during the Bashir era's later years when he tilted toward Saudi Arabia. But the current conflict provided an opening. A June 2024 investigation revealed evidence suggesting Iran had violated the UN arms embargo by supplying Mohajer-6 drones, munitions, and other support, primarily to the SF.
To the SF, to Burhan.
Correct. This was seen as Iran supporting the formal state military, perhaps as a way to counter the influence of its regional rival, the UAE, which backs the RSF, and to regain a foothold in strategically important Sudan, overlooking the Red Sea shipping lanes. It adds another layer to the proxy war dynamics. Some reports suggest they might have supplied some items to both sides early on, but the main thrust seems to be backing the SF now.
What about the broader international response? The US, the UN,
It's been characterized largely by condemnation, sanctions against individuals on both sides, humanitarian aid efforts, though severely hampered, and largely failed diplomatic initiatives. The U.S. cut off direct aid to the government following the 2021 coup and is focused on humanitarian support and sanctions. The World Bank suspended aid. The UN Security Council has discussed the situation repeatedly, including potential war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed, particularly in Darfur, as recently as July 2025, according to the outline. But has struggled to achieve consensus for strong action, partly due to divisions among permanent members. Peace talks led by Saudi Arabia and the U.S. in Jeddah, or by regional bodies like IGE, have repeatedly stalled.
Finally, the conflict has profound regional stability implications, leading to increased tensions with neighboring states.
Absolutely. The refugee flows alone are destabilizing neighbors. Beyond that, political tensions are high. The SAF government rejected Kenya's mediation attempt early on, within the IGAD framework, accusing Kenyan President William Ruto of having political and financial ties to Hemeti, which severely complicated regional peace efforts. Ethiopia also has complex relations with Khartoum.
And perhaps the most terrifying prospect is the potential for the current Sudanese civil war to merge or interconnect with other regional conflicts, especially involving South Sudan.
That's a huge fear. An alliance noted in the outline signed around February 2025 between the RSF and the SPLMN al-Hilu faction operating near the South Sudanese border is a potential game-changer. It formally links the conflict in Sudan's center and west with the long-standing conflict to the southern periphery. It also raises fears that South Sudan, itself fragile, could be pulled back into conflict if the SAF decides to retaliate by backing rival militias within South Sudan, or if fighting spills across the border. The fear among regional experts is that the boundaries between the decades-old conflicts in Sudan's peripheries and the current military rivalry in the center could become totally blurred, creating one sprawling, interconnected, and even more intractable regional war. #80. Conclusion and final takeaways.
So, looking back across this vast, often tragic timeline from the centralized power needed to build the Kushite Hafir millennia ago, through the imposition of Arabic and Islam by the Funj Sultanate centuries later, we really see the deep historical foundations for a fractured nation, often defined by competition between the center and the periphery.
Absolutely. We then covered the profound structural damage inflicted by British colonial policy, deliberately dividing North and South, and the catastrophic exclusion of Southerners at independence by the Sudanization Committee. This directly led into the deep wounds of two incredibly long and brutal civil wars, costing millions of lives.
We saw the rise and institutionalization of radical political Islam under Hassan al-Turabi and Omar al-Bashir, the horrific genocide in Darfur orchestrated through the Janjaweed, the precursors to the RSF, and the inevitable secession of South Sudan in 2011, which stripped Sudan of its vital oil wealth and destabilized the economy.
And we end at the present moment. This disastrous, intensely personal rivalry between al-Burhan and Hemeti. These are men who were lieutenants under Bashir, then co-conspirators in the 2019 removal of Bashir and the 2021 coup against civilians. Their final break seems motivated by the absolute necessity to shield themselves from international investigation and accountability for past crimes.
Right. The 2023 war was triggered immediately by the failure to agree on the RSF merger timeline, a technical issue, maybe, but one that fundamentally threatened Hemeti's independent power base, fueled largely by controlling Sudan's gold exports. The unresolved core issue remains this struggle for absolute, unaccountable control over the state and its resources.
And the history of Sudan that we've traced shows this recurring, terrifying cycle. Political instability and civilian weakness are almost always interrupted by military rule. Yet these military rulers, even when they successfully overthrow a dictator like Bashir, immediately fail to institutionalize power legitimately or transition it peacefully. They turn on each other, leading directly to the next conflict, the next purge, or the next devastating civil war.
And that cycle is now dangerously compounded by intense foreign involvement. The arms, the money, the drones flowing from outside powers, the UAE backing the RSF, Iran and perhaps Russia increasingly backing the OSF, Egypt supporting Burhan. They're ensuring that this war is sustained, deepening the suffering, and turning Sudan into a tragic theater for regional proxy conflicts over resources and influence.
So we leave you, the listener, with this final critical thought to consider. Given this history, and especially the deep foreign involvement supplying weapons and funding to both sides in the current war, does Sudan's immediate future depend more on some kind of top-down regional peace agreement, brokered and perhaps enforced by these same self-interested outside powers? Or Does the true sustainable power for change ultimately still lie somewhere within Sudan itself? Perhaps with the grassroots resistance committees and civilian movements, the legacy of the 2019 revolution, demanding accountability and a fundamental break from this cycle, even if they seem silenced by the guns right now. This history demands we consider where the power and the responsibility for a different future truly resides.